What's up, everybody? Welcome back to science class. This is going to be our part 3 of our Unit 1 Earth Systems series. In this week's episode, we're going to be taking a look at food chains and how they work, how they're organized, and how they're actually just models that show how energy flows through living things on planet Earth. So let's take a look. First things first, as always, you're going to need your online interactive science notebook to go along with this video. So go ahead and make sure you have that open. It's attached to this assignment on Google Classroom. Go ahead and open up this week's pages as we're going to be following along in the video in our notebooks. So last week we took a look at the inner workings of the biosphere, and we were looking at identifying what producers, consumers, and decomposers were. See, last week we looked at the fact that all living things require energy in order to be alive and in order to survive on the planet. Now, how they acquire that energy, whether they pull it from the sun to make their own food, they eat other living things to acquire energy, or they break down leftover waste material, determines whether or not they're a producer, consumer, or decomposer. So I want to take a quick minute here and just review those three and what they are, because that's going to be really important in organizing the structure of food chains later on. So up first, we have the producers. Now, if you remember from last week, we talked about this. Producers are typically the plants that we find on the planet. Trees, bushes, flowers, leaves, grass, all of the plants we're familiar with are typically producers. Now, the reason for them being called producers is that they have the ability to use sunlight and capture that energy that they get from the sun and use it to produce food for themselves to keep themselves alive, right? In doing that, they earn the name producer, right? Because they're producing their own food. Now, when we look at producers in the larger context of an environment, we typically find them sort of in open areas being the plants using sunlight to get their energy. But then they also, at the same time as using energy from the sun, are usually dealing with being eaten by other consumers and things like that, because producers can fall to be the food source for smaller consumers and herbivores and things like that. So typically when we look at a producer, they're taking in sunlight and using it as their energy, but at the same time, they're being eaten as a source of energy for other consumers. So they fall sort of in between there. Up next, we have our consumers, which we said are typically our animals on the planet. These are living things that acquire their energy by going out and eating things, right? They go out and eat things, and the energy that was in those living things move into them and keep them going, right? And keep their bodies working. So typically when we look at consumers in a larger environment, we'll find them either snacking on producers and taking the energy in those plant bodies for themselves. We typically call those types of consumers herbivores because they eat plants. Or consumers could be maybe a little bit larger and they get their energy by eating other consumers. We typically would call them carnivores, which would be creatures that eat meat or other animals. Either way, they're eating another living thing and taking the energy from their food source and using it to keep their bodies going. And finally, we have our decomposers here. The gross things. These are like the bugs, the insects, the mushrooms, the bacteria, the small stuff that we don't always see, right? And they need to snack on things too in order to get energy for their bodies to continue to work. However, they're usually very small, usually very weak. They don't have the ability to travel or to hunt or to go seek out food of their choice. So decomposers usually find their energy by breaking down the leftover materials that's left behind the consumers. Anything that's left behind, whether it be dead animals, leftover waste, or other things like that, decomposers can snack on this to get their energy. When we look in a larger sense of an environment, whether it is dead plants, whether it is leftover waste from consumers or dead bodies from consumers, things of that nature, when they're left behind and no other consumer wants to snack on it, the decomposers will come up and kind of break it down, right? This is why you see if things get left out, over time they start to decay and break apart. And that's because we might not see it, but there's decomposers in there that are sort of breaking it down and snacking on it. And that's how we see them in a particular environment. Now, when we put all of this together, when we look at the role of a producer in an environment, the role of consumers in an environment, and the decomposer, we can see that they're actually all sort of connected, right? There's relationships between these three. And when we start connecting them all together, that's when you finally start to see the actual chain begin to form. So let's take a look at that. So when we combine all three of these together, it forms what is most commonly known as a food chain, which is just another way of saying that it's a model that shows how energy moves through living things. Allow me to explain. If we look over here, we can see that it all kind of begins with the sun. The sun's giving off energy out into space. That energy comes to planet Earth, which is well and great. However, not every living thing has the capability to be able to use that. The ones that can are our producers, the plants. They take that sunlight, they're able to do a fancy process, which we'll talk about next week, that allows them to take sunlight and sort of do that process to make their own food, keeping the producers alive. Now that's great for them, but eventually we're going to see other things, such as little consumers, and they also need energy, and they need to eat something. So they see that plant, and they eat the plant. And in doing that, all of the energy that was in there moves into the little consumer. So now he's doing okay, he's got the energy he needs to survive, and that's great until something bigger comes along. In this example, we have a bear that comes in, and now he needs some energy. So he snacks on the little critter, the energy that was in there moves into the bear, and now the bear can survive. And the bear is pretty big, the bear is pretty tough, nobody's really messing with it. So unless something specifically happens, eventually that bear is going to die, or that bear is going to leave behind some gross waste. And that stuff that's left behind that consumers don't want to mess with, the gross things left behind, the decomposers will come in, and that'll be their opportunity to get their snack. And they'll come in and kind of break it down. They'll sort of decay all of the remains, pull the energy they can out of it to keep themselves going, and any remainders of that or waste from the decomposers can go back into the earth to possibly be reused by some plants later on. And when we look at this entire process, we see the actual food chain form, where you have the sun to a producer, producer to consumers, and then always ending back by a decomposer cleaning it all up. This is our typical structure, whether it's the Arctic, the desert, the rainforest, the Great Plains. You're going to see this pattern of sun, producer, consumer, decomposer. And the kind of the cool thing, if you look at it even further, is that if you track this energy, the energy in the decomposer, say this worm, came from energy it got from the bear, and the energy got to the bear from the little critter, and it got there from the plant, and it got there from the sun. So if we really look at it, the energy that kept all of these living things alive actually originally comes from the sun itself. And that is true for all living things on planet Earth. If you trace it back far enough, we're all actually powered by the sun. Let me prove it to you. So here we'll look at a quick example of myself. So the other night I went out to dinner, and when I was there I got a simple burger and fry meal. It was very good, it was delicious. And the food that I ate at that dinner became the energy that my body used to kind of keep me going for the next day or so. Now, let's take a look at where that actually comes from. So I'm a consumer, humans are consumers, my energy comes from the food I eat, which is great, but if we look at the food, we realize it doesn't start there. For example, the fries. If we look at the fries, those are made from potatoes. So the energy I got from the fries originally came from potatoes that were cut up. And potatoes grow as a plant, right, which are in fact producers. And we know that producers get their energy from the sun. Therefore, the fries come from the potato, which eventually leads back to the sun. Burger's a little bit more complicated. The meat from the burger comes from a cow. And so the energy I got from the burger originally came from a cow. And that cow is a consumer and got his energy by eating grass, which is a producer. And the energy got into the producer, the grass, from the sun. It got picked up by the plant itself. So if we look, no matter how we look at the meal, if we trace it back far enough, eventually the energy that got to me originally came from the sun, which is 93 million miles away in space. So that's kind of the glory of food chains, right? They serve to be an awesome model to show how energy flows through living things. And if you trace it back far enough, you can actually prove that the energy we see in any given living thing originally came from the sun as its starting point. The sun sends energy to the plants can pick it up, the plants get eaten by something, and eventually that energy makes its way to all types of living things. Whether it's us and the food we eat or animals in the wild, if you know how to set up a food chain, you can do that, and you can track that energy. So let's do a little practice here. So in your notebook pages, you're going to see a page that looks just like this. On this page here, I have a basic layout of a food chain. We're going to start with the sun, and then we're going to end with some type of waste or death leading to decomposers breaking stuff down. What I want you to do is take a pic. I have a bunch of options off to the side. I want you to drag over pictures to fill in these boxes. Okay, so the sun's going to give energy to that first box, and then there's going to be two other living things that sort of share that, eventually leading to either a death or waste being left behind for decomposers. The choice is up to you, excuse me. If you want to look at some guidance as to how to set it up, might I recommend looking at a page back in the notebook or further back in this video where we talked about the proper structure of a food chain and sort of how to organize it. Where we're typically looking at a sun going to a producer to a consumer. Consumers will trade to each other for a while until eventually something's left behind for decomposers to break down. So go ahead and work on that, and let's see what you guys can figure out. So that brings us to the end of our video this week. So when we look at food chains, again, they're just an elaborate model to show how energy is being transferred from the sun 93 million miles away to all living things on our planet, and how we're all actually powered by that energy that came to us. The energy goes to the plants, to the producers. They're able to keep themselves alive and make their own food. They get eaten by consumers. Consumers eat other consumers, and the energy flows between all of them. All right, so going forward, we're going to be using this knowledge to develop some food chains and to develop some energy models in a bunch of different environments around our planet, and better look at how our biosphere is kind of functioning and using that energy. If you guys have any questions on this assignment, feel free to leave me a comment on here or a private comment on the assignment itself. Friendly reminder again, this morning on Wednesday, I'll be doing my office hour starting at 8:15. So there'll be a Google Meet post. You can jump in and ask me any questions. If it's after that, just leave a comment and I'll get back to you right away and we can chat. Otherwise, best of luck with this, and I will see you guys later.